Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our final webinar on accessibility, answering your questions today with Deb Dorsey. Thank you all for those who are in attendance today, and I see some people that have been in some of the previous sessions as well. I am Ron Hansen, the Maryland Online Professional Development Coordinator, and in my day job, the Director of Instructional Systems at Chesapeake College. Deb Dorsey is an Associate Professor of Health at Harford Community College. Debbie is a Maryland Distance Learning Association board member, Quality Matters peer reviewer, and a 2020 NESOT Excellence Award recipient. And before I have Debbie start, I just want to go over some rules of engagement for today, as this is a little different. We had asked for some questions, and Deb has all those questions that have been pre-sent. She is going to go through those questions and answer them first. Then we will open up the floor where you can unmute and ask your questions, or you can comment in the chat or put a question in the chat, and we will review it at that point in time. But we will first go through the questions that Deb already has. Please, as we've said as our slide says, put your institution and your name and where you're from in the chat. And then I'm going to stop sharing and hand it over to Deb.
All right. I'm going to go ahead then.
Right ahead.
There we go. All right. I am going to share my screen as well. Just give me a second here to maneuver around. I have two screens, and what happens when I set it up is, Zoom tries to take over what goes on what screen. So just kind of happens. So everybody can see my screen, correct? Silence means
yes. Yes.
Okay. Yes. So we're going to go over a couple things. I've grouped them into the categories of questions that I received, excuse me, and the general questions I typically get. And so I'm going to start off with the law because it's a good jump off point. And there are, I think it's a little bit panic that we have over the law. And there may be some clarifications that people will find helpful as we go through this. Some of it, I'm sure, will be review for those of y'all who maybe know a little bit more about this. So we're talking about Title II, and the question is, of course, well, what are titles? So these are things that are passed by Congress, and titles are categories that help to organize federal laws. So when we talk about this is the law, it is part of a broader law, but the takeaway here is that it is then legally enforceable. It's the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division that enforces this. And as of right now, it's the Department of Education's Civil Rights Division that shares this authority with the Department of Justice. So essentially, these are groups, federal groups of people, if you want to call them groups, that partner together or work together whenever there is a complaint filed, or they're going to do a random audit. And I'm going to come back to that in just a second. So, of course, Title II is about discrimination against disability, and this includes a broad spectrum of things. So we're talking about digital accessibility, but Title II also does cover physical environments and things like that. So when we're going to talk about who and how, because this is I think an important distinguisher that people don't necessarily understand. So when we're talking about an individual who files a complaint with the Department of Justice, meaning there's two different things that individual can do. They can file a complaint. They can sue the institution. We'll come back to that. They can do both. Sometimes it is a group an interest group or an organization that will become part of a lawsuit on behalf of the individual or a group of individuals. So that can happen as well. If a complaint is filed with the Department of Justice, the thing that we need to realize is that that means that they're going to look at an entity. And in this particular case, an educational institution. They are not about finding whether or not a violation created personal harm. That's different. What they can do is also they can do an audit if they need to, whether or not that is something that initiates from a complaint or they just decide that you need to be audited. Um, they're going to recommend what we call a broad corrective remediation. So their audits are going to include every single part of your institution, not just your LMS, but your forward-facing website, all of those things. And one of the tricky things then for institutions, and this has been going on well before we started saying, okay, WCAG 2A is going to be our measuring stick. It's always been federal law, and so there have been major universities that then have had to go through the remediation process, and that is not exclusively bringing their content up to meet accessibility standards. It's also them having to provide, in some cases, education to the public and to their employees that is up on their website. Anybody can see it, that talks about how do you achieve accessibility. So the final implications to an institution, if the DOJ investigates and finds you responsible, culpable, is that they can then revoke your financial aid, because again, we're talking about federal money here. They can also impose fines on your institution. And so that's where the money part comes into play. Of course, the other thing that comes into play is that an institution's reputation suffers. And that will also happen with when an individual sues the institution. People often ask about loss of accreditation, and it's rare as of now. That's rare. It can happen. If it's going to happen, it usually is a result of a formal complaint to the Department of Justice. And but they could also look at us failing to meet our compliance deadline as well. So the takeaway here is that when there is a complaint filed with the DOJ, it is about the institution, not necessarily the individual. However, an individual, or like I said, a disability rights organization can sue an institution. And this is about personal harm. In the context of higher education, the harm is that we did not provide that student with what they needed to be successful. And so from an institution perspective, now we're talking about the money that they have to pay for legal fees and for settlements. And for settlement money typically comes from the operational budget. Oftentimes the institution also has insurance that covers it. Sometimes, depending on the state, there is also state assistance with funding that settlement. This usually happens in federal district court, and the individual lawsuit does not mean that the institution has to make specific changes, although they usually do, after the court ruling. And again, we have to worry about our institution's reputation. So here, the question often I get is who gets sued by the individual or the group. So it's important for us to know that it's the institution that gets sued. And this then has sort of a trickle down, I guess, or it explains some of the questions that I commonly get. Of course, from faculty, the question I'm always going to get is, can I be sued? No, maybe. So you cannot get sued, but there can be another lawsuit filed against you if the individual can prove that you took retaliation from of the retaliation to them. We retaliated to them for them trying to sue you. Federal law applies to entities. So it is the college that gets sued. A question that gets asked is, who in the college is going to take the brunt of that? The answer is that's up to the college. That's up to the institution. Whether or not they want to put, the burden of, I don't know that that's the right word, the responsibility of everything onto academic affairs or marketing, whoever. But typically what will happen, since now this applies to the entire institution, is every single person that is responsible for creating digital content is responsible. The institution is usually going to look at more than just one entity, one part of their college that is responsible now for getting everybody up to compliance. They decide. There have been times where individual officials within the college have been sued by an individual, and that includes the president and the board of trustees. Whether or not it goes fully to court is up to the court, and that probably varies by state too. And again, the institution decides who's going to be responsible for that. So hopefully that kind of provides a little bit of clarification that when people say, okay, well, where is this, whose shoulders are this going to fall upon? From the federal perspective, it's the institution. So I also get asked predictions of what will happen. So prior to this administration, it was going to be fully enforced. And at that time, what we predicted was that there would be a dramatic increase in looking at these things. There would be less forgiveness or leeway for showing good faith. Prior, there was some, not leniency, but a little bit of consideration given if your institution had been showing all along that you were trying to improve your digital accessibility, but now the projection had been that it would basically be all or none. And again, that there would be more systematic audits, meaning it doesn't necessarily have to be a complaint that drives the check. So an audit, and this would apply to your LMS, PDFs that you put up, your video libraries, your student portals, which is interesting to me because I've heard conflicting interpretations here. In some places I've heard, no, this does not apply. That seems a little suspect to me, given that, that's a main communication between the student and the institution. But vendor tools as well. So things that you use to test, to advise, to tutor your students. However, there are some factors that come into play now in our new administration, particularly political pressure. And this administration has filed a revised version. They sent it to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. There is significance here because in doing so, this does not require public comment. It is a deviation from how other administrations handled this. Basically, again, it's about money. So the political motivation for what happens with enforcement or looking at this title, that affects it. But the thing that we have to remember right now is it doesn't matter. It's enforceable. There has been no change as of yet. The feds did go after a commercial website. They're Fashion Nova, and it was February 2026. There was a couple $1 million, I think, in that settlement. So clearly, they are going to go after it. This again is the commercial realm, but if they're going to go after the commercial realm, it could have implications to education, right? We don't know. In terms of enforcement, I always like to use the speeding sort of analogy for how this works. So it's illegal to speed, right? And if you get pulled over by a police officer, you're probably not going to get away with, I always speed. Well, you've always been breaking the law, right? So when we look at enforcement, if you get caught breaking the law, there will be a penalty, even if you've been breaking the law all along. So hopefully that makes sense. Things that we need to consider, though, is the increase in dual enrolled students that we have. And of course, Maryland has a big push for that. Many states do. The thing that we need to keep in mind here is that now, unlike your sort of traditional age student or even your non-traditional age student, there's greater parental involvement with the dual enrolled students. If you teach them, you know. There are FERPA, of course, applies, but there are FERPA waivers. And the people, the parents who get involved with these sorts of things tend to be fairly well educated. They know what their rights are. And even those that don't are still, their parents. They're still going to get involved. So we also have to think a little bit about the interaction that happens between these two public entities, meaning the public school system and a publicly funded higher education institution. And so these are some things that we just need to kind of be thinking about as we're considering risk. So publishers, this is another question that I frequently get. It's complicated. Right now, we still look at this as the college adopting a publisher, an online publisher. So we can still get an individual lawsuit to a college if a publisher, if a class is using a publication or some kind of learning materials that are not meeting those WCAG standards. Also, a college can take greater action if in their VPAT, within their agreement with this vendor of software, it says specifically you have to meet the laws, because textbook publishers are still considered private commercial entities, right? So it's still, a lot of times I think what gets confused is there was a time when a common sort of belief was that if you're anything that leaves your LMS, there's like a gray area of complying versus if you embed it in your LMS. None of that is true. It doesn't matter if it stays embedded in your LMS or if it leaves to go to Redbook or your publisher's website. You, the institution, you adopted that textbook or those learning materials, and you are the person responsible for making sure then that they meet those standards. So private companies, they don't really apply in the technical context to Title II or to 508. However, what we're hoping is that there's enough market pressure to compel publishers to fall in line, for lack of a better word. And I myself have already started getting emails from publishers it's interesting, their approach has been to try to educate me about Title II, not necessarily explain to me how their publisher materials are going to achieve that. So I thought that was kind of an interesting way that they're going at this. So we talked a little bit about archived, and I think sort of what the takeaway here too is that even within very specific language, there's still wiggle room. And part of that is the nature of law, right? Law tends to want to be a little bit open-ended or a little bit open to interpretation by purpose. So when we talk about that archived material does not qualify, we have to be super careful about what that means. So they talk about something being formally retired. And oftentimes we look at that as the publisher is no longer offering some type of support for whatever those materials are. And we're going to look at this as everything that's created before the deadline. However, there is some gray area here as well. And so something, if it's truly archived, then needs to be made clear that it's for research purposes only. So you got to make sure about that. But there's also something, and again, the language to me is a little interesting, that they say that if something has changed since it was archived, doesn't matter. Then it still applies. I tried to look into this a little bit more, asking like, okay, well, does that mean like during an in progress class, all of a sudden they change it? Or you've been using this textbook or these materials for this academic year, and then suddenly they change it. My takeaway is this, and you're going to see me say this throughout. You're better off being safe than sorry, right? Regardless of if this then, we want to look at right now, making sure that everything that is in our classes, that's in our courses, that's on our website meets the Title II requirements. So another question that I get asked is about instruction and assessment. So instruction meaning the materials, the learning materials that we put up, and then assessment, whether it's a quiz or an assignment or some other way of testing learning of our subject matter. So I'm going to show, and this actually came from a question directly. This is mitosis. It's beautiful, isn't it? And you can see that there's no labeling of these stages. And so this is the kind of image that I see typically show up in a quiz that is a hotspot question. So for example, which one of these shows this XYZ stage of mitosis? I ran this image through Copilot, and it gave me just sort of a very generic description. Lumen Learning, which is where I pulled the image from, really what they would typically do, not all Lumen Learning does this, but when you look at their alt text, a lot of times what they show is more what we call a long description, not necessarily alt text. But in this particular case, Lumen Learning said, cell going through the 6 stages of mitosis. So if you put a hotspot question in there, how does that person know which one to select? And so again, if we ask in a hotspot question, identify the part of this image that represents prophase, obviously we wouldn't then have the labels throughout these different stages because that's given away the answer. It's not even that with hotspot questions. Sometimes it's also about whether or not the person can actually navigate them with a keyboard. They are not always assistive technology friendly. There has been a movement to start making those. I watched a very interesting session at a Brightspace conference that talked about how they are working on technology that can help with the hotspot questions so that people who use screen readers can answer these. But when we again look at this is the same question, so a diagram. Another example of alt text would be, if I use this, diagram showing several cells arranged in sequence, et cetera, there are arrows to show. But again, the question always becomes, if I have a visual impairment, or not even that, if visual impairment is not an issue, but I have to use assistive technology besides a screen reader to answer this question, that could be a problem. So my answer is always sorry, but no. And I encourage you to think about other ways to hit those legal requirements. I'll scoot back a whole lot here and come at this from faculty perspective, which is what I am. I am faculty. When we start talking about this with faculty, there are going to be 2 things that faculty bring up. One is time. You're asking me to put the time into rearranging, redoing a large section of my course. Also, and I don't agree with this perspective, but they will bring up academic freedom and everything that means. So what I try to explain to faculty is your academic freedom does not mean that you are not held to federal law. So you have to find that middle road place. But I would be I to not acknowledge that this is time intensive work. I have to be honest, it is. And so when we think about how do we meet those legal requirements, what we could be looking at is replacement of that hotspot question or replacement of any question that requires the person to be able to interpret the information that is in that image. So we look at text-based labeling questions, maybe drag or drop, provided that it is something that works with our assistive technology, and a description or a list of options that the student can choose from. I have had many conversations with STEM and nursing faculty where this is a challenge. And that is the question that keeps coming up is, well, how do I make this accessible without giving away the answers? Or how can I make this accessible where it seems like this person has a greater advantage than another student? Those are complicated questions to answer. But at the end of the day, our legal obligation is to create an equal opportunity, an equal experience for people with disabilities. So the other thing that we can sort of put this under a lens of universal design. And so when we look at multiple means of representation, a lot of times we talk about alternative formats. A lot of times we talk about, can you put stuff into like a scenario question? But representation under itself is complicated because we also talk about, well, what do we do for people that are visual learners? Okay, there's the word visual. So you're a visual learner, but if the visual stuff is not meeting accessibility standards, then universal design doesn't necessarily or can't be used as a reason to encourage people to change their content. So these are the questions that I have, and I see there's some things in the chat, but I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions and to answer, anything that might be in the chat. But I want to preface by saying I'm always very nervous when people refer to me as an expert. I'm not. I am always learning, and there are things that I don't know, and there are things that I might not have an answer to the question. But usually, if I don't have the answer, I know somebody that I could ask, and that would know the answer.
Right.
So,
Well, Deb, we do have one from Rose Miller. She's asking, is the NCLEX held to the same requirements? The NCLEX is the nursing test.
that's a good question. And truthfully, I so if it so how do I say this? That is well, I'm not sure the answer, but here would be my guess. If it's being administered through a federally funded institution, or if the federally funded institution has it part of assessment, it needs to meet it. It depends. What Title II always goes back to is the federal institution. So whether or not that is something that the institution makes, the institution that partners with. I know that a lot of these questions have come up in terms of nursing. From my experiences with our nursing faculty at Harford, they're aware of it and they're really working through it. I think that that's the best answer that I can give. it's complicated, especially in these. So I'm going to say something that sometimes I'm like, should I do this? I don't know. There is a reason why blind people can't drive. And so when we look at these occupations where life or death decisions are made, and these life or death decisions also require the individual making them to be able to truly understand what they are. These are things that we need to consider. I never want to frame something in a way that if a person with a disability truly has aspirations to do this thing, that make them feel discouraged. At the same time, it is, I believe, fair to say that there are going to be certain things that people with disabilities cannot do, like drive. Does that make sense? I hope I answered it a little bit. Some of the answers to my questions are always going to be, here's what I think might happen, but I'm not totally certain.
This is an interesting one because, because I know you're like, and if you have a program, NCLEX requires you to have a certain passing rate on the NCLEX for your program to be approved and everything like that. So that, it's NCLEX that's actually building the test and offering the test. So that's interesting.
Yeah, and I would imagine that they are going to be viewed, even though they're a product in an educational setting, that they are probably going to be viewed under commercial, like a textbook publisher. I don't know. Is there a I would imagine that there's a state connection there. Is that accurate?
I don't know. I just know that NCLEX has a certain, you have to have a certain number of, you have to have like 80% passing rate or something like that of your students.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that is a good question. With when we get into these really specific subjects, areas, that's where I always encourage people partner up with your other institutions, talk about what they're doing, go to University of Maryland's resources, see what they think, so that you can start sort of accumulating this knowledge base, but also, get ideas about how other institutions have interpreted this and what they're doing about it. Because we're all in this together. Other questions?
if you have
Any?
other questions, please, not just about today, but from the previous sessions about PDFs or websites or whatever, anything that Deb has covered over the last couple of months.
What I always say is please, please, please email me questions. I have a super easy email, Dorsey, all one word, at harford.edu. Like I said, if you have a question, I don't have an answer to it, I usually can point you in the right direction to somebody who might. We actually stayed right on time, which is great for me.
Yeah.
That's a first.
Well, if there are no other questions, let me share the slide for your credit purposes here. Let me.
Oh, Carly, you have a question.
I just
Oh,
had
yeah.
I got in here late. I had a meeting and I got in late. But what did you respond to? How are they going to enforce the use of this, the Title II in all of our websites and so forth?
So enforcement is going to be something that is initiated. There's two different ways. One is that you get, or what prompts enforcement, right? One is somebody files a complaint. So now at this point, you're under the microscope. You need to start showing, from a federal perspective, when we talk about who's going to enforce it, the way that they enforce it is they cut off your financial aid or your research money or something like that. That's how they're going to enforce it. From an if an if a individual sues your institution, that's a little different. That's not the same as federal enforcement, of course, but again, it could prompt you. Then the question becomes whether or not it's going to be a random audit of the institution. And that's really more about detection than enforcement. And that could be, again, just a random audit, or someone says to the federal government, you are in violation of this. And so enforcement means that usually from an institution perspective, I'm not getting federal money anymore. And if I'm repeatedly violating Title II, I'm going to lose my accreditation. Enforcement also suggests ongoing monitoring, right? And again, the question becomes, what's going to trigger that? Is another complaint to the DOJ going to do that? Is them monitoring you after they've done an audit, periodic checks throughout? Some of this is unknown. And sort of talked a little bit about the political situation, the political climate, and that also adds a layer of unknown. Does that help?
Yes, thank you, Debbie. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Okay, a reminder, if you need proof that you've attended, take a snapshot or a screenshot of the certificate that's up. And also a reminder that if you have attended each live session, we have a record of that, and we will be getting out a special certificate to you that you've attended the full series, probably within a couple of weeks. But we will get that to you, and we do appreciate those of you who have been attending live every session. And I do want to thank Deb very much for doing this. This is the second time she's offered this series. She's given us wonderful updates and hopefully a lot of helpful information for you to meet the deadline in a couple of weeks and beyond, or continue with the work. And I'm going to stop sharing this slide. If there's any other last questions? Well, then I'm going to stop the recording and say thank you very much to everyone.